Hey guys, tonight we're starting with metal, leather straps, and just enough shame to keep your neighbors entertained for hours. You're in a cobbled Scottish village. Mist is crawling over the hills. Sheep are bleating softly, and you are being marched to the town square with an iron muzzle locked around your face. That's right, the scold's bridle. A device specifically made to stop women from speaking, often featuring a little metal plate that presses down on your tongue if you even think about saying something cheeky. Comfort? Not included. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, maybe a castle, or just curled up with your cat in Kentucky, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where our sleepy little time-traveling community is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand barefoot in the center of the village. It's somewhere in early 1600s Scotland. Exact dates blur, especially when records were mostly kept by people who really didn't want to write about women talking. Around you, curious eyes peek from behind door frames, little fingers point, and the smith is finishing the buckle on a contraption meant to teach you a lesson in modesty. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, wasn't invented for murderers, thieves, or even tax cheats. No, it was reserved for women accused of being scolds. The term itself? Comically vague. It could mean nagging, gossiping, publicly disagreeing with a man, laughing too loudly, or simply having opinions that didn't match the parish elders. Medieval Scotland wasn't exactly hosting feminist poetry slams. The bridle was a headpiece of iron bands with a built-in bridle bit, a flat iron plate forced into the mouth, pressing down on the tongue to prevent speech. Some versions had bells attached, so everyone would know you were being punished even before you turned the corner. It was not discreet. Humiliation was the whole point. Now, you might be picturing something brutal and bloody. But pause. The cruelty here was quieter, more calculated. It was about psychological pressure. Humiliation turned into a parade, with shame as both punishment and performance. Public shaming had a long tradition in Europe: stocks, pillories, whippings, but few devices were as specifically targeted as the brank. A man might lose a hand for stealing. A woman? She lost her voice. Here's a fact for your sleepy brain. The first written mention of the scold's bridle in Scotland appears around 1567 in the Burgh Records of Glasgow. It was used well into the 18th century, even as late as the 1800s in some remote places. The official justification? To preserve good order. But let's be honest, it was more about keeping women visibly obedient. There's debate among historians whether it was ever truly widespread or more symbolic, used rarely, but remembered constantly, like a boogeyman made of iron. And here's the odd twist. Some branks were engraved with verses, rhyming couplets, moral warnings, sometimes even prayers. One known example read, "A woman's tongue is a deadly sting. Peace and silence is a blessed thing." Cheery, right? There are records of women collapsing during these public humiliations. Some lost teeth. Some fainted from the sheer pain of standing still with a metal bar on their tongue while townsfolk threw rotten food. Occasionally, children would be brought to watch, an early form of don't end up like her education. That's right. Medieval parenting. No iPads, just public trauma. But not all punishments came from the top. Sometimes it was local wives who ganged up to demand another woman be punished. Maybe she'd spread a rumor. Maybe she owed them bread. Or maybe, as one 1633 account from Perth suggests, her husband just didn't like her tone and had connections. Historians still argue whether the brank was more a tool of patriarchy or community gossip warfare. Likely, it was both. Let's drift a little deeper into the village air. The blacksmith's hammer fades. A dog is barking somewhere near the bakery. You can smell peat smoke, oatmeal, maybe something fermenting. And the woman, yes, you, stands with an iron cage clamped to her skull, while the town clerk reads her sins, not crimes. Sins. Things like uttering base and uncharitable speech, or disturbing the peace with constant clamor. One quirky tidbit. In Aberdeen, a brank was kept on permanent display in the council chamber, not for decoration, but as a threat. Like hanging a paddle in the classroom and never needing to use it, because just seeing it was enough. Fear made speech polite, and the weirdest part? These devices were considered moral correctives, not torture. Church leaders argued they were humane alternatives to whipping. Women were told to be grateful they weren't being flogged. Classic. You squint through the eye slits of your brank, trying not to salivate, because the bridle bit makes swallowing hard. Your jaw aches. Your scalp itches beneath the band. You want to scratch, to spit, to shout something clever, but you can't. And you realize this is the point, not to punish a single sentence, but to make you think twice before ever speaking again. And so, you stand, silent, sore, and stared at, until someone, usually a man in a hat too large for his dignity, declares you chastened. Then the brank comes off. You go home. You don't talk much after that. Let the fog roll in a little thicker now. Let the echoes of iron on tongue dull into nothing. And keep that bitter metallic taste in mind, because in the next village, a woman's punishment for talking back isn't metal at all. It's water. Your feet slosh through mud, skirts damp with the dew of early morning. Chickens scatter ahead of you, and the village green is already noisy with chatter, except none of it's yours. You've been warned before. This time, it won't be an iron bridle. This time, it's water. Cold, murky, and public. Welcome to the era of gossip laws and ducking stools. The village you're in now is likely in 17th century England, somewhere near Norwich, or maybe Bedfordshire. Either way, the vibe is the same. Timber-framed houses, children with questionable hygiene, and local justice with a very wet twist. The ducking stool sits near the riverbank, or maybe it's mounted over a stagnant pond behind the blacksmith's. It looks almost playful from afar, like a rustic seesaw or oversized cradle. You almost expect a toddler to crawl into it. But this chair is reserved for a very specific crime, being a woman who says too much. Yes, gossiping was an actual offense, not in the way we casually toss the word around now. In medieval and early modern communities, being labeled a common scold could land you in hot soup, literally. These women were seen as social threats, disturbers of peace, potential catalysts for village drama that might spiral into witchcraft trials or neighborly feuds. And so the solution? Douse them into silence. You're strapped into the ducking stool, hands bound, feet tied to prevent kicking, and hoisted over the water by a very creaky wooden arm. Around you, a crowd has gathered. Of course they have. Justice in this era is a team sport. Children cheer, a few vendors sell cider, and someone's cousin is probably sketching you in charcoal. You are now part of local entertainment, a historical fact for you to float on. The ducking stool was first documented in England around the late 13th century, though it really gained traction in the 1500s and beyond. Some towns used them regularly, others just like the threat. It wasn't exclusively for women, but let's be honest, it nearly always was. Men might brawl or lie or commit treason, but women, their voices were the danger. Now, if you're wondering how long they dunked people for, here's the thing. It varied. Sometimes once, sometimes several dips. A really unlucky woman might get held under for what the record books call a reasonable duration. That's a historian's way of saying long enough to rethink everything. Some even lost consciousness. It wasn't supposed to kill, but accidents happened. Here's your quirky detail. In some Welsh villages, the ducking chair was mobile, mounted on wheels. They'd wheel you through the streets like a macabre parade before tipping you into the town's dirtiest water source. And if your crime involved brawling or scandalous words, you might get dunked multiple days in a row. Soggy justice. Historians still argue whether these punishments were about maintaining social order or suppressing female agency. The punishment often had little to do with the truth of the accusation, and more to do with how unladylike your voice was perceived. One widow might be targeted for questioning a grain price, another for shouting at her neighbor's goat. The specifics didn't matter. It was the volume, the boldness, the refusal to shrink. You sit in the chair now, drenched and humiliated. There's moss clinging to your shoes. Your braids are dripping, and you're shivering not just from the cold, but from the memory of everyone's eyes on you. Some might whisper sympathy, but softly, carefully. No one wants to be next. And here comes the next twist of the knife. After your dip, you aren't offered a towel. There's no blanket, no apology. You're expected to walk home like nothing happened, as if your voice wasn't just punished in front of half the village. And you do, because you have dinner to make and potatoes to peel and maybe children to hush. Life doesn't pause for shame. You pass by the same women who watched you get ducked. Some nod, some avoid your gaze, some look smug. It's complicated. This world trained women to fear each other's defiance. If you get punished, they feel safer. And tucked between these muddy laws and gossip punishments lies one curious tidbit. In a few rare cases, women were charged for not gossiping enough. That's right. A record from 1629 in Sussex tells of a woman accused of being willfully silent and thereby suspicious. No win conditions here. Talk too much, and you're drowned. Say too little, and you're hiding something. You finally reach your cottage. You change into a dry shift. You sit by the hearth, and you make a decision you'll probably regret. Maybe tomorrow you'll speak a little softer, just until the next woman is strapped into that chair instead. Let's tiptoe now from the riverbank to the altar. Because while village punishments were messy and mossy, marital vows came with their own built-in gags, and silence could be written into love. The bells are ringing, not for punishment this time, but for celebration, or so it seems. You're standing in a little stone chapel with a floor that tilts slightly downhill. Someone's strewn herbs down the aisle, and it smells like rosemary and damp linen. You can barely hear yourself think over the drone of Latin, but that's fine. No one here expects you to speak, because in this wedding ceremony, your voice isn't needed much at all. Marriage in the medieval and early modern world wasn't exactly a Hallmark movie. It was more of a contract, two families agreeing to exchange property, livestock, and reproductive potential. Love wasn't off the table, but it certainly wasn't the main course. And for women, especially, marriage often came with a clause: silence. Here's a fact to pin to your sleeve. Some marriage vows, especially those influenced by religious orthodoxy, included explicit promises of obedience. Not just in general terms, but in very specific, verbal ones. Obedience of thought, of action, of speech. If a woman contradicted her husband in public, it could be considered grounds for correction, or even annulment, in the case of noble unions. You glance sideways at your groom. He's wearing wool that smells faintly of smoke and ambition. You don't know him that well, but you know this. Once you say, "I do," speaking up may no longer be your right. Let's zoom in on something especially peculiar. In certain parts of 15th century France and the German states, priests were known to warn brides that a silent wife is a gift from God. It wasn't just poetic, it was doctrinal. Religious texts, sermons, and household manuals reinforced the ideal of the quiet woman. She listens, she obeys, she does not contradict, and she certainly doesn't offer unsolicited opinions about the grain tax. This wasn't just for peasants. Even royal women faced expectations of verbal submission. In one 16th century case, Margaret of Parma, governor of the Netherlands, was chastised for being over-articulate in council meetings. Imagine that. A woman literally assigned to govern being criticized for speaking while governing. Let's detour for a moment into one of the odder fringe facts. In a few wealthy households, marriage contracts came with mutinous clauses. No, the bride wasn't expected to literally never speak, but she was required to refrain from contradicting her husband in public. If she did, he could fine her, restrict her movement, or, most comically, revoke her sewing privileges. That's right. In some households, embroidery was considered both a privilege and a reward for silence. Stitch quietly, or don't stitch at all. You're back in the chapel now. The priest drones on. You murmur a few rehearsed words. The ring is slipped on, and just like that, you're bound. Not just legally, but socially. Your voice now echoes his, like a chorus with only one soloist. Historians still debate how often women in medieval marriages were truly silenced versus how often they found ways around the rules. Letters, songs, and court petitions written by women show cleverness, defiance, and wit, but also the tightrope walk of phrasing everything just so. One extra word, one wrong tone, and a woman could be labeled a scold in her own home. After the ceremony, you walk through petals, or barley, depending on local customs, and into your new household. There's a maid who whispers too much, and a neighbor who eyes you like she's taking mental notes. Your husband introduces you to the fireplace, the kitchen, the loom, not the study, not the ledger, not the stable. Those are his spaces. There's one small bright spot, though. Some women managed to carve out domains where their voices still mattered. Midwives, for example, held authority that even priests had to acknowledge. And in some regions, like parts of Catalonia, women ran textile cooperatives and dictated trade decisions. But even then, their speech was often confined to female-only spaces. Public opinion remained skeptical. A woman who spoke like a man was still seen as not quite a woman. And here's the whispered joke from the time, scribbled in the margin of a 14th century German manuscript. 3 things ruin a household: a leaky roof, a gassy dog, and a wife with opinions. Funny, right? Unless you were the wife. You sit by your new hearth that night, spooning lentils into a bowl. Your husband is discussing trade routes with a cousin. You think you know a better route. You don't say it. Instead, you focus on the fire. Watch the way the wood splinters, the way the flames mutter. They get to talk. Now, let's take a little walk again, through back alleys and side doors, to find out what happens when a woman doesn't play nice. Because marriage wasn't the only institution enforcing silence. Sometimes, the punishment came from neighbors, from peers, from a public that wanted drama, and got it in tar, feathers, and laughter. The street smells like yeast and onions, which might sound cozy, until you realize you're walking past a woman being dragged toward the village square, and she's covered in tar. Not warm, not theatrical, not pretend. Real, black, sticky tar. And feathers. Dozens of them clinging to her like a plucked goose in reverse. She's not a criminal, not in any official sense. She didn't steal or fight or burn anything down. No. Her real offense? Talking too much about her dead husband's will? Or possibly criticizing the miller's flour? Or maybe just surviving her husband longer than people thought proper. The town has decided she needs a little correction, a feathered correction. Welcome to one of the more bizarre punishments of the medieval and early modern world, the tar and feather spectacle, sometimes called riding the stang. It was half punishment, half parody, public mockery with a thick coat of humiliation, and a strong side of misogyny. The woman is forced to sit backward on a horse or cart. That's the first bit. Backward riding symbolized shame, a world turned upside down. Then came the song. Local boys or men would chant cruel verses about her supposed misdeeds, how she nagged, how she cursed, how she wore her skirts too short. Sometimes it was just nonsense rhymes made up on the spot. The point wasn't justice, it was comedy. Now, a curious historical note. While tarring and feathering is more famously associated with the 18th century American colonies, its roots stretch back much earlier in European folk tradition. Charivari in France, or rough music in England, was a noisy, mocking ritual used to punish perceived social violations, especially those committed by women. Widows who remarried too quickly, wives who wore the pants, or spinsters who spoke freely. You're walking beside the cart now. You can hear the snickering. You notice a few women in the crowd, not cheering but not stopping it either. Fear binds people tighter than chains. And these events were sometimes orchestrated by neighbors, not officials. It wasn't always the king's justice, it was kitchen justice. Well-stoked, homemade, and petty. One quirky, awful tidbit. In some Dutch towns, rather than tar and feathers, they used soot and eggs. Easier to clean up, still plenty humiliating. The woman might be tied to a stool and spun around like a children's game gone wrong, while neighbors shouted, "Hen at ya! Hen at ya!" Basically, "Little hen." Historians still argue whether these rituals were meant to discipline or simply to bond communities through shared cruelty. Was it about control, entertainment, or both? What's clear is this: women were disproportionately targeted, and more often than not, it was their speech that got them there. Talking too much, questioning, refusing to be quiet in mourning. You sit on the edge of a stone wall now, watching as the crowd disperses. The tarred woman is left behind, sticky and feathered and shivering. No one offers a cloak. No one helps her down. She pulls at the feathers. Some come away in clumps. Some stay. And you wonder, will she ever say another word in public? But silence wasn't just forced with branks and chairs and shame. It came through reputation, too. Through labels that clung worse than tar. The nag, the hag, the shrew. These weren't just insults. They were warnings. Once a woman had one of those pinned to her name, her words lost weight. Her voice, her story. It became laughable, ignorable, suspect. Here's something strange to ponder while you rest your feet. In a 1592 court record from Sussex, a woman named Agnes was punished not for what she said, but for the way she raised her eyebrows while another man was speaking. The court called it contentious demeanor. That's right. She didn't even open her mouth. You stand now, brushing dust off your hem, and start walking again. Because there's another sound drifting down the alley. The ring of a gavel, the rustle of parchment, the murmur of a gathered crowd. We're about to step inside a medieval courtroom, where talkative women became part of the official record. Not always punished physically, but displayed, dissected, and dismissed. One verb at a time. Wood creaks beneath your shoes as you step into the courtroom, a modest hall that smells like beeswax, ink, and damp cloaks. The air hums with a faint mustiness of expectation, the kind that settles whenever people gather to watch someone else be shamed. There's no jury box, no powdered wigs, no polished benches, just a crowd, a clerk, a magistrate whose robes have seen too many winters, and a woman standing in the center of it all. She's not bound or gagged, but she might as well be. Today's case? Slander, defamation, perhaps public disorder via tongue. The exact charge doesn't really matter. What matters is that she spoke, and now she's been called to account for it. She's accused of saying a married man looked too long at the baker's niece, or that the vicar smelled of gin, or that her own neighbor's baby might not share her husband's nose. Small things. Harmless? You might think so. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially in towns like York or Canterbury, such talk could drag you in front of a court. And not just any court, church courts. These were places where the clergy, not the crown, decided your fate. And if you were a woman, well, you had the double disadvantage of being seen both as sinful and inherently more prone to verbal crime. A historical fact to lean on. English ecclesiastical courts kept meticulous records of women charged with defamatory speech, more so than men. Not because women spoke more, but because their words were seen as more dangerous. Speech was their only real tool. Men had swords, women had scandal. You sit in the back, trying not to cough. The clerk is droning out the charges, carefully reading aloud the woman's exact words. But here's the joke. It's not about truth. Whether the thing she said was accurate doesn't matter. Only whether it caused offense. Defamation wasn't about lies. It was about social harmony. And a woman who disrupted that harmony with her voice, she had to be handled. The punishment might be public apology, or a fine, or standing in the town square holding a sign that read, "I am a slanderer." Or, if the judges were feeling particularly poetic, she might have to wear a paper crown scrawled with the word scold. Heavy is the head that talks too much. Here's your quirky detail of the day. In one recorded case from 1614, a woman was sentenced to sit at the local well for 2 hours a day, with a bucket tied to her waist and a wooden ladle strapped to her hand, symbolizing her bucket full of lies. People came to mock her. Some brought actual soup. Historians still debate whether these punishments were symbolic or effective. Some argue they reflected deep anxieties about gender roles. Others believe they were more about spectacle, keeping communities amused and orderly at the same time. Either way, one thing is clear. Female speech, once labeled dangerous, could be turned into public theater. The magistrate now glances over his spectacles. He asks the woman if she has anything to say in her defense. She opens her mouth, closes it, opens it again. She tries a few words. Measured, modest. She's learned the script. I regret my words. I meant no offense. It was not my place. She does not defend her truth, only apologizes for having spoken it. You watch the court nod along, already bored. A few scribes mutter. One is doodling. This is not justice, it's rehearsal. A social ritual, repeated so often, no one even hears the words anymore. She's dismissed. She curtsies awkwardly. No one claps. No one spits. Just silence. You follow her out, your steps matching hers. She walks stiffly, not out of pride, but out of calculation. Too soft, and they'll think she's weak. Too fast, and they'll say she's fleeing guilt. And as you trail her down the lane, you start to see it. These aren't just one-off punishments. They're cumulative. They layer. A warning here, a dunk there, a humiliation over breakfast, a shameful muttering in church. They stack up like logs. Not enough to burn you at once, but enough to keep your spirit just warm enough to bend. Let's keep walking, shall we? Because as we leave the courtroom behind, we pass by the abbey, the orchard, and the shadow of a cloister where someone else is sitting alone. A woman, quiet, careful, but not forgotten. Because even in silence, women left marks in margins, in diaries, in whispered stories told by candlelight. And one of them Soon enough, will find herself the subject of disgust in a monk's journal. Not for anything she did, but for how she spoke. You step into the cloister now. The air is cooler here. Stone walls keep the heat out and the silence in. A fountain trickles softly somewhere nearby, and you can hear the quiet scrape of a novice's sandals across the flagstones. It's peaceful. Peaceful enough to feel like sanctuary. But then you hear them. The words, not from a woman, but about one. Inked in tight Latin on parchment, folded neatly between sermons and glosses, penned by a monk with clean hands and a deeply suspicious mind. He's writing about a milkmaid, not a queen. Not a heretic, just a girl who sold cream and honey in the mornings and said things that made the brothers shift in their seats. She laughed too easily, sang while she worked, whistled, yes, whistled, while milking the cows, and once, unforgivably, asked a question during a public reading of scripture. You watch the monk pause. His quill hovers, then dips again. He calls her tempting, immodest, audibly dangerous. These aren't just insults, they're diagnostics. In the world of monastic scribes, a woman's voice could be a symptom of sin, of pride, of impending chaos. This wasn't new. Christian monastic tradition had long held the idea that women's speech was inherently suspicious. St. Paul himself urged women to keep silent in church, remember? It is not permitted unto them to speak. Centuries later, monks still took that line very seriously, and this is your historical fact. In the Regula Magistri, an early monastic rulebook predating even St. Benedict, women's voices were described as waves that crash upon a brother's purity. That's right. A woman speaking could cause actual moral erosion. No wonder the milkmaid's humming was considered treasonous somehow. You slip through the courtyard and see more of these little glimpses. In a Cistercian letter, a nun is rebuked for speaking before spoken to. In a Dominican sermon, a noblewoman is chastised for addressing a bishop with unfiltered questions. Over and over, you find these strange moments where the female voice is held like a burning coal, too dangerous to touch directly, too tempting to ignore. Now, your quirky tidbit. One monastic manual from 13th century Burgundy suggests that women should be addressed through veil or screen when possible, especially if they are known to speak warmly. Speak warmly? We're in a place where even tone is cause for alarm. You almost want to ask what happens if she smiles while talking. Does the ceiling fall in? Historians still argue whether monastic disgust at female speech was rooted more in theology or insecurity. Did they really fear temptation? Or were they simply annoyed that someone outside their cloister had the audacity to critique the sermon? There are essays, of course, debates at conferences, footnotes that loop around each other like gossip in Latin. No one agrees. That part hasn't changed. But here's what has changed. In the margins of those same monkish texts, you sometimes find odd additions, not just critiques, but poetry. In one illuminated psalter, a monk copied the lyrics of a local shepherdess's song in red ink. In another, a female voice is scribbled in, soft, half-faded, but there. She said the stars follow the moon like geese. No judgment, no sarcasm, just a preserved sentence. You sit now on the stone bench, letting the cool settle into your spine. Imagine her again, the milkmaid, hair tied back with a ribbon she dyed herself, hands chapped from winter, voice clear as morning bread. She didn't mean to insult the monks, but she spoke where quiet was expected, and that was enough. And what about the monk? He probably didn't even look at her directly, but her voice followed him back to his cell, It echoed in his head while he chanted psalms. It bent itself into the shape of distraction. And so he wrote her down. Not her name, not her story, just his feelings about her noise. A voice preserved as a warning. Let's stand again now. Walk with me through the low wooden door at the back of the cloister, into a cottage that smells of rosemary and ash, a place where another kind of woman speaks, not loudly, but with herbs and dreams, and maybe just enough words to get herself accused of witchcraft. The door creaks softly as you step inside. It's warm in here, surprisingly so. Dried bundles of herbs hang from the rafters. Mugwort, rue, lavender, things with names half forgotten by modern tongues. A pot bubbles gently over a low fire, releasing a smell that's part stew, part mystery. And in the corner, bent over a wooden stool, is the woman the villagers call wise, or dangerous, or, when the wind changes direction, witch. She hears you come in, of course, but she doesn't turn right away. She's grinding something, seeds, maybe bark, into a paste, muttering under her breath. Not spells, not curses, just instructions to herself. Her voice is scratchy with age, but there's a rhythm to it, a cadence, like someone who's had to whisper most of her life and only recently started speaking full sentences again. This is your first lesson tonight. Wise women, midwives, herbalists, bone setters, weren't persecuted just for what they did. They were persecuted for what they knew. And knowledge, in a woman, had a sound. It sounded like warning, like challenge, like power. And that made it dangerous. Historical fact, coming your way. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of women across Europe were tried for witchcraft. Not all were executed, but many were. And while not every accusation stemmed from speech, a surprising number did. A woman was often reported for having uttered a curse, murmured a spell, foretold a misfortune. See the pattern? Not potions, not familiars, just words. One famous case in 1590s Scotland involved a woman named Agnes Sampson, accused of bewitching the king's ship. Her crime? Allegedly speaking a charm during childbirth that later coincided with a storm. Her knowledge of healing herbs and old rhymes sealed her fate. She was tortured into confession, her head shaved, her voice permanently stolen by fear. But let's get weirder. Here's your fringe fact. In a remote corner of Bavaria, one woman was charged with witchcraft because she spoke Latin when no man was around to teach her. That's right. Her knowledge of grammar was seen as devilish. Apparently, being a multilingual peasant was less believable than being in league with demons. And back in this cottage, the woman is finally standing now. She offers you a cup of something warm. It smells like fennel and honey and things you can't quite name. She tells you how to treat a fever, how to settle a restless child, how to stop bleeding with a ribbon tied at the ankle. Each instruction comes quietly, like a gift wrapped in hushed vowels. Then she pauses. Her face shifts. She tells you to be careful who you repeat these things to. Not everyone appreciates a woman who talks with confidence. Historians still debate whether witch trials were truly about religious panic or if they were cover stories for punishing inconvenient women. Many trials occurred in places undergoing social strain, economic collapse, plague, famine. And often, the women accused were older, poor, unmarried, or simply disliked. But the consistent thread: many had reputations for being outspoken, not unruly, just firm. You finish your tea, thank her, and step back outside. The wind has picked up. Someone's watching the cottage from the edge of the trees. You don't recognize them, but they're not smiling. Even today, folklore sometimes frames witches as seductresses, or hags. Rarely do we talk about them as scholars. But they were field scientists, oral historians, walking almanacs, and their voices carried not just stories, but systems of knowledge, passed down in kitchens and gardens long before universities opened their doors to women. And when those voices got too loud, that's when the firewood was stacked. So you walk on, past the gate, back to the town. There's more to this story. Laughter behind curtains, quiet notes passed under doors, laws written in ink, but enforced with looks. We're headed next to a convent, but not for peace and prayer, for discipline. Because even there, especially there, women's words could get them in trouble. The convent rises up before you. High stone walls, a slate roof slick with mist, and a bell that tolls with the stubborn rhythm of obedience. You step quietly through the archway. Inside, the hush is so complete it feels physical, like a woolen blanket wrapped around your entire body. Even your breath dares not be too loud. You've come to a place devoted to silence, to prayer, to the careful curating of thoughts so they don't spill out into the air where they can tempt, distract, or disturb. You think you'll find peace here, but peace, it turns out, comes with punishments. The nuns move past you like ghosts, faces half hidden under linen wimples. Some smile faintly, others are unreadable, eyes locked on the cobblestones as though searching for a dropped word they regret. One brushes past you, carrying a basket of potatoes. She hums under her breath and then suddenly stops, glancing around as if caught in a sin, because here even humming can be a transgression. Your historical fact. In many medieval convents, strict rules were enforced not only around speech, but around when and how women could use their voices. The rule of St. Benedict, adopted in various forms across Europe, mandated silence in certain parts of the day and during specific tasks. But for women, these rules were often enforced more severely, with infractions noted, reported, and sometimes punished with penance or public humiliation. You step into the refectory. No one speaks. Wooden spoons tap softly against bowls. If someone coughs, they cover it quickly. A novice sneezes. 3 women cross themselves immediately. You're not sure if it's for her soul or the sound. You sit at the edge, near the hearth, and listen to the soft scrape of feet, the creak of benches. This might feel serene, but you can sense the tension beneath it, like stretched thread. Every glance is measured, every movement performed with a kind of emotional whisper. Why? Because even a badly timed giggle could land you in the punishment book. Let's take a detour into something particularly strange. In a 14th century convent in what is now Belgium, a nun named Sister Anne was forbidden from speaking for 40 days. Not because she shouted or insulted, but because she told a funny story during a mending session that caused 4 others to laugh out loud. Their laughter was deemed disruptive to spiritual discipline. Anne's punishment, isolation, and silence. The others, confession, and 3 days of bread and water. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some convents used penance pebbles. These were small stones given to nuns who spoke out of turn. You had to carry the pebble in your mouth for a full day. Yes, literally in your mouth. It wasn't sharp or painful, but the sensation was enough to remind you not to speak. Practical? Sort of. Demeaning? Definitely. Historians still debate how much these rules actually reflected lived experience. Were most convents truly this strict, or was it just the ideal presented in rulebooks? Letters between nuns suggest that real life was more flexible, filled with chatter, laughter, even gossip. But even so, there was always the risk that a careless word might be overheard, reported, or misunderstood. So silence wasn't just a rule, it was a survival tactic. And yet, Within this silence, women found ways to speak. They wrote marginalia, devotional poems, coded letters. In one 12th century manuscript, a nun drew a tiny image of a woman holding a scroll that reads, "I speak with my ink." She didn't need her voice to make a sound. You walk now through the convent garden. Lavender, sage, rosemary. The scent is strong enough to calm the world outside. A few nuns are pulling weeds. One hums, ever so softly, a tune you think you recognize. Maybe something from the folk songs of your last village visit. It feels like resistance. And resistance, in a place built on obedience, is risky. But perhaps the most powerful rebellion here wasn't laughter, or humming, or questions. It was something quieter, preserving thought. Through copying texts, through annotating psalms, through recording the dreams of women who refused to be reduced to silence, even when that silence wrapped around them like a veil. Let's head toward the edge of the garden now, where the gate opens onto the town square. Because while convent walls were thick, they couldn't keep the outside world from pushing back. And in that world, women who raised their voices, especially in public places, faced something harsher than silence. They faced mockery. Next stop, the noisy marketplace, where speech is currency, and women who dared to use it became punchlines. The noise hits you before your feet even touch the cobblestones. This is not a place of silence. This is the medieval marketplace, alive with the caw of traders, the bleat of goats, the creak of carts, and the sing-song sales pitches shouted into the morning fog. The smell is a full-body experience: mud, onions, fresh bread, and something slightly fishy, possibly alive. And here, amid the clamor, are the women. They're not in the shadows or behind veils. They're front and center, hawking eggs, shouting about pickled eels, lifting baskets of wool, and bantering with customers who try to knock a halfpenny off the price of everything. These women are not silent. They're vibrant, fierce, funny. And for that reason, they've been caricatured for centuries. Your historical fact. By the 15th century, the figure of the market woman had become a stock character in literature and popular jokes. She was loud, argumentative, and often cast as a symbol of chaos in male-written texts. In one English morality play, a woman who sells poultry is portrayed as a threat to social order simply because she talks back. You pass a stall where a woman is selling rushlights. She calls out to a passing friar, teasing him for eyeing her apples more than her candles. A few onlookers laugh, but not all laughter is kind. One man mimics her voice in falsetto. Another mutters something about hens that squawk too much. The woman pretends not to hear, because that's the game. You can speak, but not too well. Not too loudly. Not too cleverly. If you're sharp, you're a shrew. If you're funny, you're dangerous. And if you sell better than the man beside you, you're unnatural. Here's your quirky tidbit. In several parts of late medieval France, especially in urban centers like Rouen, women were forbidden by guilds from using certain sales pitches. Specifically, they weren't allowed to make puns. Yes, really. Male guild members claimed witty speech created unfair competition because customers were drawn more to humor than product. So if you're wondering whether women were punished for being too clever with words, the answer is literally yes. Fined for puns. You wander deeper into the crowd. A fishwife is arguing over the price of cod. Her sleeves are rolled up, her hands are wet, and her voice carries across 3 stalls. She wins the argument. Her customer walks off muttering. A boy nearby sings a rude rhyme about her voice being louder than a bell tower. She throws a fish head at him. The crowd laughs. Historians still argue whether these women were truly empowered or simply tolerated. On the one hand, market work gave them financial independence, public presence, and daily verbal sparring that honed their wit. On the other hand, these same traits made them targets of jokes, slurs, and even minor legal complaints. Some men filed reports accusing market women of excessive vocal conduct. That's right, talking too much while selling fish. And those rhymes, they weren't innocent. In England, skimmington processions, mock parades meant to ridicule people who upset gender roles, often included effigies of loud women. They'd be dragged through the streets, sometimes with bells or pots tied to them, to create a cacophony meant to imitate and mock the noise of female speech. But even amid mockery, these women carved out real power. They formed informal unions, created networks of trade, set prices, arranged deliveries, even controlled seasonal supply. One particularly bold woman in 14th century London was known to negotiate directly with ship captains, a huge deal at a time when women weren't even supposed to speak in court without a male relative. You sit now on a crate, nibbling on a roasted chestnut someone pressed into your hand. Around you, the market begins to quiet as the sun climbs higher. Shouting gives way to murmuring, haggling turns into packing. And the women? They carry their unsold goods home. Some will count coins, others will nurse sore throats. A few will remember every word they weren't supposed to say. But today, they said them anyway. Now follow me. Let's leave the marketplace behind and head toward higher towers and tighter halls, places where even queens learned the sharp edges of silence. Because when a woman had real power, her words weren't just mocked, they were feared. Stone floors stretch ahead of you now, cold beneath velvet slippers. The scent of rosewater lingers in the air, carried on the hems of gowns embroidered with pearls. You've entered a palace, not a hovel, not a stall, but a seat of real power. Tapestries line the walls, courtiers hover like moths. But even here, with all the glitter and gold, something remains the same. Silence is expected, especially from women. You walk beside a queen. She is poised, elegant, every movement deliberate. Her gown whispers as she glides down the corridor, a language in itself. But her mouth? Still. Her voice? Chosen with precision, if at all. Because in court, a woman's words are not her own. They're currency. And too much talk can bankrupt you. Let's start with your historical fact. Even powerful royal women, from Eleanor of Aquitaine to Catherine de' Medici, were often reprimanded, slandered, or undermined when they spoke with authority. Eleanor, despite ruling 2 vast territories and going on crusade, was accused of being overbearing. Why? Because she negotiated, publicly, in front of men. Scandalous. In courts across medieval and Renaissance Europe, queens were expected to influence policy with glances, not speeches. Subtlety was prized, deference mandatory. And when they did speak plainly, chroniclers sharpened their quills. Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of England, was mocked as a schemer. Isabella of Castile, yes, the same one who helped fund Columbus, was called unwomanly for speaking in council. You pause in a sunlit chamber where a noblewoman is reading aloud, very softly, from a letter she received from her cousin in Navarre. She stops mid-sentence when a man enters. She lowers her eyes. He doesn't even notice. And here's your quirky court tidbit. In 16th century Spain, women at royal court were banned from initiating conversation with male diplomats unless spoken to first. In fact, one court manual explicitly stated, "Silence in the Queen is not only modesty, it is the clearest sign of divine favor." Translation: if she doesn't speak, God must approve of her. Of course, historians still argue how strictly these etiquette codes were enforced. Some say they were more aspiration than reality, that strong queens simply worked around them, whispering to confidence, writing persuasive letters, hosting salons. Others point to how damaging the expectations were, how a single sharp word could spiral into a scandal. The truth? Likely both. Royal women walked a tightrope stretched between diplomacy and erasure. You catch sight now of a girl no older than 16, freshly married into court life. She's learning how to smile without showing teeth, how to hold a goblet with grace, and how to ask for what she needs without forming a direct question. It's a kind of code, one that, if broken, leads to whispers behind fans and a sudden lack of invitations to dine. And when the code failed completely, there were consequences. Take the case of Anne Boleyn. Sharp-tongued, politically astute, clever in both courtly speech and flirtation. For a time, her words helped her rise, until they didn't. When her downfall came, many of the charges, treason, adultery, were padded with claims about inappropriate conversations, boastful speech, and rumors she laughed at the king behind closed doors. Her voice, once admired, was used as evidence against her. So what do queens do when speaking becomes dangerous? They write. Letters, mostly. Quiet, careful, layered with meaning. Elizabeth composed speeches she sometimes never read aloud herself. Catherine de' Medici penned more than 3,000 political letters in her lifetime, each one a brick in the fortress of her influence. When you couldn't speak freely, ink became the safest voice. You move now through a long hallway toward a private chamber. Inside, a queen sits at her embroidery frame. A diplomat's note lies folded nearby. She's choosing her words carefully, pen in hand. Her ladies-in-waiting are nearby, humming. A dog naps by the fire. But make no mistake, this room is not idle. This is where policy is softened, alliances are shaped, and rumors are carefully countered one stitch at a time. The embroidery she's working on? A phoenix, rising from the flames. You exhale slowly and step outside once more, through arched gates and back into the city's quieter corners. Because we've seen the voices mocked, gagged, and muted. But there's another kind of silence worth exploring. One wrapped in silk, one that glittered, smiled, and held its tongue. Next, we visit a place where silence was luxury, where noblewomen, too refined to speak plainly, used gold thread and painted fans to say what they couldn't out loud. The manor grounds are still, not silent like a monastery or muffled like a courtroom, but still in a way that tells you everything is being observed, carefully, elegantly. You walk beneath arching trees, gravel crunching softly beneath your boots, until you reach the house itself. Whitewashed stone, latticed windows, and peacocks parading like they own the lawn. Inside, it smells of dried roses and wood polish. You're in the world of elite women now. Not queens, not fishwives, gentry, nobility, the velvet class. Here, women don't shout, they don't plead, they don't laugh too hard. Instead, they stitch, they glide, they pass folded notes with wax seals. And when they speak, if they speak, it's with deliberation so practiced, it may as well be calligraphy. This is silence's style, your historical fact. In many noble households of the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in England, France, and the Italian courts, a woman's reputation hinged on how well she managed the art of quiet. Chatter was for the kitchen. Wit was tolerated in the salon, but only if it was paired with discretion. The perfect lady? Measured, graceful, murmuring if absolutely necessary. You step into a drawing room. A cluster of women sit around a low table, working embroidery hoops. Not a word between them. But look closer. The patterns are coded. One stitches a crowned serpent, an insult in thread. Another works a pomegranate split in two, a symbol of marital fracture. They aren't speaking, but they're saying plenty. And here's your quirky detail. In 17th century Italy, Noblewomen often embroidered their frustrations into pillowcases. These designs included symbolic wounds, little red blossoms with jagged edges, and unblessed fruit, overripe pears or apples left to rot. One preserved example includes the Latin phrase taceo, ergo vivo, stitched in silk. I am silent, therefore I live. You notice now that even the way women hold their hands conveys social status. A loose wrist suggests availability. A stiff fan implies deflection. It's choreography, a daily ballet of subtle cues that avoid the vulgarity of speech. But don't let the elegance fool you. These women were smart. Many were multilingual, well-read, and politically engaged. They just weren't allowed to show it openly. So they played the long game, patronized poets, hosted salons, taught their daughters how to make a statement with a half glance. Historians still argue whether these elite women were victims of oppressive etiquette or masters of coded rebellion. Some say they were stifled into decorative silence. Others see them as geniuses of subtext, fluent in the language of restraint, able to influence men and policy without ever raising their voices. The truth, again, likely lies in the space between. A servant passes through, bowing slightly. One of the women lifts her chin, not a word, just a flick of the eyes, and he disappears again. This is power, dressed in stillness. Outside you hear a carriage wheel, a guest arriving. The women rise, fans are opened, smiles are affixed like fine jewelry. The conversation begins, but not the kind with volume, the kind with layered compliments, soft chuckles, and 1,000 miles of meaning behind a single, "How lovely to see you." But beneath the silks and lace, there's friction. A letter hidden in a sleeve, a snub at the last banquet, a son's inheritance being questioned. These women are playing high-stakes games in low tones. And here's something you might not expect. Some women chose silence as rebellion. There are accounts of noblewomen refusing to speak at dinner or going entire seasons in contemplative quiet, a fashionable affectation that allowed them to withhold opinion while still appearing ethereal and mysterious. One lady in 18th century Vienna became famous for going 3 winters without uttering a full sentence. People thought she was enchanting. She was mostly just sick of being interrupted. You take one last look at the drawing room. A new piece of embroidery has begun. A fox and a rabbit sharing a pie. Symbolic? Almost certainly. Spoken aloud? Never. Now, back through the manor door, down the stairs, out past the herb garden, where peacocks are now screeching in a way no woman here ever could. Because across the sea and the sands, other women are also being silenced. But the methods look different. More spiritual, sometimes musical, sometimes strange. Time to take our story further afield, to the women whose voices were shaped not by corsets or courts, but by culture, ritual, and rhythms half the world away. The air shifts as you travel now, not just in temperature, but in texture. The familiar fog of European history gives way to dry wind, thick jungle air, high-altitude crispness, and everything in between. You've crossed oceans, stepped off galleons, and wound your way through mountain paths and desert roads. Because silence wasn't only European. All across the world, women's voices were shaped, softened, or erased, but always in culturally specific ways. You find yourself now in Mali, in the heart of the old Songhai Empire. The air smells of sun-warmed leather and millet bread. A gathering of women sits in the shade, weaving baskets and telling stories. Except the youngest among them is silent. Not because she's shy, because she's expected to be. A girl must listen before she earns the right to speak. Here's your historical fact. In many West African cultures, including among the Songhai and Yoruba, women's speech was guided by age, status, and lineage. Young women were trained to observe and absorb. Speaking too early or too confidently was seen as disrespectful. But silence here wasn't always oppression. Often, it was preparation. The wise women, the griots, the female oral historians, spoke with power, but only after years of quiet listening. One girl points to her grandmother, who begins a tale in a voice so low you have to lean in to catch it. Every word is deliberate, rhythmic, half-sung. She's not just telling a story, she's performing memory. And in these traditions, forgetting is the real sin, not silence. And now, hop across to Japan. You're in a Heian-era household, somewhere in the 10th century. The world is calligraphy, lacquer boxes, and silken screens. Women here are rarely seen, and almost never heard in public. But their words are all over the court in the form of poems, delicate, sarcastic, coded. This is where you meet your quirky tidbit. Waka, short lyrical poems, became the preferred form of emotional communication between elite men and women. But women owned this space. Some, like the poet Sei Shonagon, became legendary for their wit. Still, everything was written. Read aloud, sure, but only behind screens, in carefully timed exchanges. A woman's laughter heard too clearly in the wrong corridor could end a career. You step now through a desert town in northern India, where the air smells of turmeric and smoke. In some Brahmin households of the 18th century, upper caste women practiced gunghat, a form of veiling that included silence. A woman didn't speak in the presence of her father-in-law, sometimes not even her husband. She communicated through gestures, through songs sung during rituals, and, if she had to, through other women. Historians still debate whether these customs were purely restrictive or part of a broader sacred system of respect. One thing's clear: when your voice is limited, your eyes, your posture, even your footsteps become language. You now cross the Pacific to a longhouse in pre-colonial Polynesia. A woman here chants, softly, but publicly. Her voice rises, strong and clear, in a genealogical poem passed down for generations. Here, finally, you see something different. Speaking isn't forbidden, it's expected. Because to forget your ancestors is to dishonor them. But even in this seemingly empowering space, women's voices are tied to role. One mispronounced name, one mistimed tone, and the entire chant becomes suspect. And finally, step into a village in the Andes, high above the clouds. Here, Incan noblewomen participated in festivals where they sang in rounds, their verses tied to agriculture and celestial rhythms. But outside ritual, their speech was tightly controlled. A woman could be punished for giving advice to a male elder, even if she was right. Especially if she was right. One preserved record from Spanish colonial priests describes an Incan widow who, speaking with knowledge of planting cycles, contradicted a governor and was publicly reprimanded for having the tongue of a man. Imagine that. Knowing when to sow maize was revolutionary. So what do we make of this global patchwork? Historians argue whether silence across cultures always means oppression, or if it sometimes signals spiritual discipline, social nuance, or resistance. But here's the through line. Wherever women's voices carried knowledge, they became targets. Wherever speech meant power, someone tried to confine it. Whether through veils or poetry, ritual or law, the result was the same. The voice became a contested space, and now you walk back toward the horizon. The wind shifts again. You hear chants, whispers, muttered proverbs, lullabies. Voices that weren't meant for courts or sermons, but that survived anyway. In thread, in song, in rhythm. And soon, we'll listen to how some women, once royal, once muted, found a way to speak again, even when their voices had been officially silenced. You follow the breeze back to the stone towers and manicured courtyards of Europe. But this time, you enter through a smaller gate, a side door. You're not here to see queens or market women, but someone even more complicated, a noblewoman, a widow, a woman whose voice has been written off, officially dismissed, and yet somehow she's still speaking. You find her in her private chambers, hunched over parchment. Candlelight dances on the gold trim of her sleeve. She's writing, carefully, relentlessly. Not a diary, not a love letter, a petition, a formal request for land rights or guardianship, or repayment of a debt owed since her husband's death. In this world, a widow has a strange kind of freedom, and a dangerous one. Here's your historical fact. In many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, widows were among the few women allowed to act independently in legal and economic matters. They could manage estates, file lawsuits, oversee contracts. But there's a catch. The moment they spoke too much or too forcefully, the privileges shrank. Fast. You glance at the woman's ink-stained fingers. She's used to this now, navigating the fine line between assertiveness and impropriety. Her letters have to be firm, but not angry. Detailed, but not presumptuous. Every word must convince the reader that she's capable, without being threatening. And now your quirky tidbit. In 17th century France, aristocratic women often included miniature embroidered letter pockets in their bodices. Inside were tiny, folded notes with scripted appeals or polite refusals, meant to be delivered by handmaids with specific verbal instructions. In one surviving example, the note reads, "I am not present, but my silk will speak for me." These weren't just affectations, they were tools. Tools for women who had been denied formal voice in court, but learned to weaponize fabric, gesture, and reputation. A noblewoman might not be allowed to stand in council chambers, but her ribbons, her seal, her calligraphy would appear there, like whispers sewn into protocol. You now enter a hall where painted portraits line the walls. Most are men, but here and there a woman stares out. Lace collar, gaze steady. Historians still debate whether these women had actual political clout or were merely symbols of dynastic continuity. But in many cases, records survive that tell a different story. Behind the throne, beside the title, there were women writing letters to ambassadors, bribing clerks, ghostwriting speeches for sons. One noblewoman in 15th century Italy signed her letters with the phrase, "In place of the silence you expect." Scholars believe it was a dig at her male relatives, who had refused to read her requests aloud in court. Her solution? She wrote them down and copied them dozens of times. Some still survive. Beautiful script, brutal content. Of course, not every woman had this access. Most didn't. But the few who did, who clung to their titles or estates after a husband's death, understood that their voice was provisional, allowed, but never embraced, tolerated, but never trusted. You sit now in the gallery, across from one such portrait. The woman's expression is composed, but her hands are clenched just slightly on the arms of her chair. Not fear, not pain, tension, a kind of poised resistance. You imagine what she wanted to say, and couldn't. How many sentences were edited into sighs? Let's take a breath here. Because it's not all gloom. Even with limits, women found astonishing ways to say what mattered. They created networks of correspondence across countries. One Dutch noblewoman reportedly ran 3 different salt trading ventures through letters alone. Another, in Prague, kept a book of sayings in which she recorded every moment a man underestimated her and turned them into parables. Historians are still uncovering these fragments, margins filled with unofficial thoughts, letters unsigned but traceable by phrase. Legal records with suspiciously elegant phrasing that hint at female authorship. Every phrase a kind of echo. And then, of course, there's the silence that was never filled. The voices that weren't recorded. The women who never wrote, or couldn't. Their absence is also part of the record, and maybe the loudest part of all. You stand now, brushing lint from your sleeves. The letter-writing widow has finished her draft. She seals it with wax, pressed not with her family crest, but a small flower. It's symbolic, of course. Everything is. The messenger waits. She says nothing, but everything she needs to say is already folded inside. You head now toward a softer space, not courts, not markets, not cloisters, but kitchens, bedrooms, hearths. We're going to the one place where women have always had some voice, however small, and the many ways even that space came with rules. The kitchen greets you with warmth, a real, living heat, rising from an open hearth where something fragrant simmers in a wide, black pot. You've stepped out of castles and courtrooms and into the rhythm of everyday life. A thatched roof overhead, clay underfoot, and the smell of stewed cabbage and toasted barley curling into your clothes. This is where countless women throughout history found a measure of freedom, not in public halls, but beside firewood and flour sacks. The home, their domain, their prison, their theater. A place where speaking was both permitted and policed in the same breath. You sit on a bench near the door. A woman stirs porridge with one hand and shushes a toddler with the other. She's talking, to herself, to the child, to no one in particular. Quiet, rhythmic, almost like spell work. These are domestic words, harmless, useful, often ignored. But make no mistake, this is not the kind of voice the world feared. This is a contained voice, one that stays behind walls. Your historical fact for this evening. In many medieval and early modern societies, a woman was considered modest if she confined her speech to domestic matters. Recipe swaps? Acceptable. Instruction to children? Necessary. Opinions on law, clergy, or politics? Not so much. But here's the twist. Speech that seemed harmless was often anything but. Kitchens weren't just spaces of labor. They were also information hubs. News came in through servants, apprentices, traveling peddlers. And women talked. Not with trumpets or titles, but in whispers while kneading dough, over mending, through lullabies. One quirky tidbit. In parts of rural Germany, it was common for women to encode gossip into recipes. Boil the herbs until they confess their secrets, reads one line in a 17th century household manual. The dish, harmless. The message, anything but. These recipes were passed along like codes, an informal underground of kitchen talk. You now step into a smaller room, a bedroom sparsely furnished. A child cries. A lullaby begins. Sleep now. The rooster's away. The wind has secrets it won't say. It's sweet, repetitive. But like many lullabies across cultures, it's also strangely ominous. Lullabies weren't just for comfort. They were for caution, to teach obedience, to remind a child, especially a girl, that silence was safety. And now you reach the hearth again. A grandmother is telling a story to a ring of children. It's about a clever fox and a greedy merchant. The fox wins, of course. But woven between the animal antics is a commentary on taxation and pride, and who gets to speak in court. The children laugh. They don't yet know the story is doing double duty. They don't yet know that stories are where women put the things they couldn't say aloud. Historians still argue whether the domestic sphere was truly empowering for women, or just a quieter cage. The truth lies in the details. Some women used the home to build networks of resistance. others lost their voices entirely inside it. The line between hearth and hush was never clearly drawn. You sit again near the window, where laundry flaps like flags of surrender. Two women lean close, sewing. One says something low. The other giggles. You'll never know what the joke was. And maybe that's the point. Their words weren't meant for record books or laws, but they happened. They mattered. And here's something few talk about. Silence wasn't always external. After years of training, of punishment, of subtle and not so subtle correction, many women internalized the expectation to stay quiet. A wife might hesitate before offering an idea. A mother might swallow her frustration. A girl might choose not to sing in front of guests. These aren't dramatic silences. They don't come with iron bridles or ducking stools, but they last. And they echo. You stand now. The stew is nearly done. The child is asleep. Outside, the air is cooling, and the light is turning to amber. You can feel the hush settling across the house, the kind that comes not from rules, but from habit. But even here, even now, a woman might whisper to her sister in the dark, might write a line of poetry in the dust behind the dresser, might teach her daughter a song that means more than it says. We're nearly at the end of this journey, but there's one last place to go. Not a physical place, but an echo. A quiet room filled with fragments, letters, songs, sighs, words not forgotten, just waiting to be heard. The room you enter now is quiet in a different way. Not sacred, not enforced, just soft. Dust dances in the light filtering through a tall, narrow window. A few books rest on a table. A folded handkerchief sits beside them. This place isn't a courtroom or a kitchen. It's more like an archive of memory. And here, in this last quiet chamber, we listen not to punishments or customs, but to echoes. These are the fragments left behind by voices that weren't supposed to survive. You open a letter. The parchment crackles. The ink is faded but legible. It's unsigned. Maybe it was never meant to be sent. A draft. Or a whisper. It starts. I spoke once and he did not hear. I wrote instead. You look to the next object. A piece of embroidery framed in glass. It shows no name, no crest, just a vine tangled around a birdcage. Inside, a key dangles from the beak of the bird. No caption. But it doesn't need one. Throughout history, women found ways to mark their silence, in coded symbols, in diary entries tucked into recipe books, in hymns sung slightly too loud, in needlework that looked decorative but burned with private meaning. Your historical fact. Many of the most famous literary voices we now celebrate, Christine de Pizan, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Mary Wortley Montagu, began their writing in the margins of other people's texts. Literal margins. They weren't given space. They carved it, and yet most voices didn't make it into books at all. They were carried on the breath, from grandmother to granddaughter, in lullabies, in herbal chants, in warnings whispered behind church pews. These were not voices meant for posterity. And yet, here they are. You pick up a page from a folk song collection. It's from 18th century Scotland. One verse reads, "Speak not of love at the market stall, for tongues are watched and wagged by all. But sing it soft, near broom and gorse, and silence rides the bridle horse." That's your quirky tidbit for the night. A lullaby about silence itself, passed from voice to voice, surviving precisely because it didn't draw too much attention. Historians still argue which silences were chosen and which were forced, which women wanted to disappear, and which were shoved behind the veil. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better one is, how did they survive anyway? Because they did. In songs, in metaphors, in letters where the first word is scratched out and the second begins mid-thought. in legal petitions where a woman signs only widow of, because even that small claim to voice was an act of defiance. In those places, speech lived on, not loud, but stubborn. And here's something else to consider. Some silences were strategic, tactical, a form of agency. To say nothing, sometimes, was to protect yourself, to stay alive, to avoid losing the little power you had. Not all resistance is loud. You stand now in the center of the room. Behind you, 14 rooms of memory and muttering, iron bridles, ducking stools, legal transcripts, gossip songs, embroidered warnings, letters never sent. All of it leading here, to this last space, the softest one, the one with the least noise but maybe the most meaning. The window lets in a breeze. You close your eyes. You hear nothing. Then, slowly, something like breath. A hum. A few words forming in the dark, not because they are allowed, but because they are needed. So let's slow everything now. Let the wind fall silent. Let the pages stay open. Let the voices rest. So here you are, drifting in the quiet after a long walk through centuries of soft resistance. The sounds of punishment have faded, the clink of iron, the splash of water, the rhythm of laughter turned cruel. Even the whispering has quieted now, like leaves settling after wind. The words that once circled rooms, wagged tongues, and drew too much attention have curled gently into stillness. You rest now among the fragments, the echo of a lullaby, the pressed impression of a stitched phrase, the softness of breath that meant, for a moment, a woman felt safe enough to speak. And that, maybe, someone would listen. Breathe slowly. Let your chest rise, then fall, then rise again. Imagine each breath gathering dust from old letters and blowing it gently away. Each exhale making more space for thought, for memory, for quiet company. If you're listening in bed, let the weight of the blanket hold you. Let your limbs grow heavier with each blink. Let the silence you carry now be one of safety, not erasure. One of softness, not fear. One of having nothing left to prove and everything already said. You are not alone in the quiet. There are centuries of voices here, low and steady and waiting. You've heard them. And maybe tomorrow you'll remember one line, one image, one rhythm. But for now, just rest. Let the past exhale with you and sleep.